Welcome to the Lighter Side of the Spectrum, a podcast where we explore how to find joy, connection, and growth while navigating the challenges of parenting kids and teens on the autism spectrum. Remember that inclusion and hope are key to making life better for everyone, and that even in the most challenging moments, there's always a lighter side. Now here's your host, David Kaufer.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lighter Side of the Spectrum. Thanks for joining me again. And I also want to say thank you for all of the great feedback I've gotten from our early debut podcast. It means a lot to me. I think if you're listening and or watching this podcast, that means that you have someone special to you, probably on the spectrum, or you're involved some way. You're a parent, maybe a grandparent, looking to support those in your life. And, it just means a lot to me to get that kind of feedback, because obviously that's why we're here, is to try to help those. It's a journey, and obviously we try to take a lighter side approach to it and bring to you different guests and resources. And today I'm super excited about our guest. She's someone I've known a long time. I'll talk about this in a little bit, but let me do a quick introduction. So our guest today is Rosemary White. Rosemary owns and operates pediatric physical and occupational therapy services here in Seattle. Originally from Australia, as you'll hear, Rosemary has been an occupational therapist since 1972. She brings a wealth of clinical experience to her work with children and their families. And in addition to the clinical work, Rosemary is very active in teaching and consulting throughout the U.S. and globally, including the UK, Canada, Europe, South Africa, Trinidad, Barbados, Taiwan, Brazil, Ukraine, and Australia. Wow, Rosemary, you have gotten around. Like I said, we were first introduced to Rosemary when our son Stone was, I think, 3 years old, was when I think we just kind of reviewed the intake form, which was kind of fun. And of course, since he's turning 19 literally next week, went through therapy for a number of years. And like I said, happily, we've been able to begin therapy again recently. He's now a lot taller than Jeanette, his original therapist. But anyway, Rosemary, thank you for joining me and being on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. I like I said, there's so much to talk about. And like I said, it's, starting with, the therapy. Like I was going to mention that Stone started when he was 3. And like I said, we had a pause. We at the time, we thought it was just going to be kind of a pause. I think we were trying to figure out, it's when he went into elementary school, I believe. And at that time, of course, so, turn the clock back, I guess that would have been about 10 or so years ago. That was also when there was a lot of, I don't want to say buzz, but kind of a lot of pressure for families who had kids on the spectrum to try different therapies. Of course, speech therapy, because Stone has communication challenges being a non-speaker. So we had to get him into speech therapy, and then ABA therapy was something that was really being pushed hard. And then, like I said, there was school, and they were like, how do we juggle it all? And this is one of the things I think that so many parents have to face that I think you could speak to. But, Rosemary, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit, what kind of drew you to the field of occupational therapy? And can you tell us a little bit about what drew you in and what's that experience been like?
Well, obviously, I trained to be an occupational therapist a long time ago. But just to give you an idea, in Australia, we go straight out of high school into our profession. So I became an OT when I was 20. And you can do the math so you can see how old I am now, but that's beside the point. But one of the things that I was passionate about is I wanted to work with children. But also, as I started to work, I started to really think about neurobiology. And I was really interested in understanding motor development. So as a new graduate, I went to Europe, which is what a lot of Australians do, and I did a graduate course in what's called neurodevelopmental therapy. And so my beginning work was really understanding movement. And then after traveling around, I was able to come to the United States, and I worked at a hospital. But then not long after that, I started working for GNAs, who developed sensory integrative therapy. So I went from motor to then thinking about the balance between motor and sensory. And with GNAs, we started working with children we were working with children with autism. So that was in 1976. And so in essence, I've been working with individuals who are autistic since 1976.
Wow.
And one of the things is that I was doing a lot of teaching and training of individuals. And we really started to see that thinking about sensation and movement, we also started to think about how do we modulate sensations? It's not as though everything comes in exactly the same way, but the environment influences, et cetera, et cetera. And we influence the environment. And one of the things that we became aware of is how do we understand regulation? So regulation is like, how do I take in the world and respond to it? And one of the things that, started to come in is I really started to think about how do we, as we relate to the children and the caregivers that we're working with, to really support relationships. And that's how I got invited to join the faculty which is really invested in DIR Floor Time. So it's a developmental approach that really looks at the individual child, but fosters relationships. So it's very much about relationships. And so one of the myths is I've been working with children since 1970, with children with autism for many, many years. And I have never met a child who is autistic who is not social.
Right.
Social. It's almost like we have to, though, think about how do we tap into support that ability to really express my social capacities, or flip that, how do we alter our actions to be able to enable the child and the caregiver to really, embrace that social piece. So again, I think sometimes the environment or the way people interact staves off or hinders the ability to be social, because the environment could be too much or the demands could be too much. And so we have to constantly thinking about ourselves as we interact with an individual, just the same as if I met you, I'm not going to talk with you exactly the same way as I would to every other person. It's not really that, but we also really adapt according to each person. And so the last 24 years that I've been doing DIR has embraced motor development. It's embraced sensory processing. It's embraced thinking about the environment. And most importantly, it's embraced parents. I want to use the word caregivers and their children, or I don't know, sensitive and social way.
Can you talk a little bit about DIR Floor Time? Because even though you've been working in the field for a number of years, obviously, and I know in our area, again, it's fairly well known, I would say, kind of in the autism community, and it has a great reputation. But I still think probably there are a lot of people that aren't necessarily familiar with it, and kind of like, and the role kind of it plays kind of in the OT world. And if you could just kind of talk about that a little bit.
Well, the beautiful thing about DIR Floor Time, it was developed with Stanley Greenspan, who was a pediatric psychiatrist, and Serena Weeder, who's a clinical psychologist. And they began working in the 80s. And what's interesting about that is they were working with multi-problem families, but really individuals had a very constricted developmental life in terms of social emotional development. And then they were parents, and the way they were parenting their children was really constricted by their own experiences. So they started working with mothers and really working in terms of psychotherapy with them. So coming from the mental health part, so looking at supporting the wellness of the caregiver. They also started working with the caregiver in terms of how they relate to their infant and toddler. So it was very much about how to help the parents read their child's cues and respond to them. The babies then, the children were you could say, had a healthy projection in terms of their development. And the constriction was with the caregiver. And they had very positive outcomes. And then it sort of flipped a little bit. What if the child was the one who had the constrictions in terms of their ability to interact and relate because of their underlying neurobiology? And so that's how it became an approach in terms of working with children and their families who are autistic. And it was developed by a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist. But then they started to really think about, and had OTs coming in saying, well, what about the individual profile? You're looking at it from a mental health perspective, but what about the neurobiology? And so that's how the I of DIR became broader. And it's a multidisciplinary approach. So I work with psychologists, clinical social workers, speech and language pathologists, educators, music therapists, dance therapists. We all come together and we're all thinking about relationships and how do we support and tailor the interactions to that individual child and caregiver. And one of the things is that our waiting room is busy whenever the hour is, say at the hour, and then it's empty because all the parents and caregivers are in the sessions.
Right.
beginning, I used to work with children, and the parents I'd always had the parents in the room, but I was the one getting all the warm fuzzies in terms of the interaction with the child. And when I began in DIR Floor Time, it shifted, and I moved back and supported the parent in their interactions. So 1 hour a week, if I'm getting all the warm fuzzies and the parent's just sitting there or actually sitting in the waiting room, the rest of the week, they don't have it. So one of the things that we're really thinking about is, and as I get older, it's been a very beneficial thing, that I can just sort of lie on the floor and I'll be watching the parent and the child playing, and I'll go, that was just a gorgeous moment. What did it feel like for you? So then asking the parent. And with COVID, I shifted totally to telehealth, and I still do a lot of telehealth. And so I'm sitting at home, and mom and dad are in the house with their child or the siblings, and I'm providing support for the parent as they play with their child. And we're looking at, what are some of the goals that you want to achieve today? Let's explore it more. So one of the things we do is, you might say, oh, it's so hard to get out of the house in the morning. And, as an OT, I used to think, and we all do, is, well, let me give you this solution and that solution and that solution. And now I do much more, tell me more about it, and really get down to the nitty gritty. And then we explore it. What do you think would work for you? And so the parent is coming up with the solutions, and we're working together more. And that's and that's one of the things that I think DIR has given me, that gift to be able to give the gift back to the parents and the child, rather than me feeling like I'm a top-notch therapist and I can have all this fun with your child, but rather, what can you take away as we're engaging? And if you look at Stone, he's almost 19 next week. And so then it's more, you're there, but it's about Stone being the one who is really leading the relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a big change, obviously. Like, it's a great point. And I was just going to say, I think, again, from my personal experience, and again, going back to when he was young and when we first began the DIR Floor Time, I think probably it's like a lot of parents, in that, again, it's so hard to know how to connect with your child when they're that young, particularly, again, if they have a disability, and if they're non-speaking, if they have challenges, right? So you both kind of want it. You both, like you said, it's just kind of this innate human need. We have to bond with our parents and children and whatever. But it's hard to kind of know how to do that. And I thought, that was one of the things I really got out of it personally, because I was the one who went to a lot of the sessions with Stone, was kind of that coaching and the ability of, like you said, kind of learning how to mirror the play. And I think it really helped him understand in a very real way that I was there for him, and that I was interested in forging that relationship in a way that's really kind of hard to do in just kind of the day-to-day life that you have.
And I think one of the things that you think about when Stone was younger, and I was just talking with another therapist yesterday, when a child comes in who's 2 or 3, and one of the things I think is beautiful is, we always talk about, so many of the children love trains, and they love to look at the wheels of the train, or they love cars, and they just, but I always think, so many of the children, when they're able to express or share with us what they're experiencing, I understand now that they see so much more depth in terms of what they're looking at visually. So sometimes I'll just get down on the floor with the parent, and we'll look at the trains, and I really appreciate that the child sees so much more depth in it and intricacies than our vision is. And so you look at some individuals who are autistic, and then we see later on in their life, they have this incredible artistic expression and sharing with details. So it's sort of like, you want to get in there and really think, how are you enjoying this? What can I join you with too? So that's and that's part of DIR too, is like really thinking about, okay, how do I join the child, rather than trying to make the child become this person that
Yes.
Which is another myth builder that I think we talk about deficits and disabilities. And I think I have really taken that word out of my vocabulary, and we don't use the word disorder. I don't even think spectrum is the right thing in a way, because it's neurodiversity talks about all of us in the world. And so we want to think about, instead of deficits, we want to think about strengths. So what are the strengths that a child comes in with, and how do we join their strengths? Because the strengths will really help us then come in and support those areas that need a little bit more support. So that's where you understand the individual child, because you're going to understand what is the uniqueness of that child and how can we help them at times when things might be a little overwhelming. Things might be a little bit, how do we tailor our voice? How do we modulate our voice so the environment feels more rhythmic as opposed to bombarding? There's so much we can do in terms of humans and in our relationships.
Yeah, can you share a little bit? You're talking about the kind of being the bombardment and stuff. And again, just based on your vast experience working with so many individuals, try to paint a little bit of a picture of kind of what some of these, especially younger kids, may be going through from a sensory perspective. And again, and then how that impacts them. Like you said, both from obviously from communication, relationships, all those types of things. But just can you try to talk about your experience in that?
Well, one of the things I think is really powerful, a lot of people use this word that an individual is defensive. They're tactily defensive, they're auditorily defensive. And that has such a negative connotation. Whereas when I think about it, and I think about sound, I hear a sound, and then because of the neural networks, the information comes in to my auditory cortex, right? And then it goes to sensory association, where I pair the sound with a visual image, with an emotional memory. Now, if the processing of my neural networks is a little lagging, so I hear the sound, but it doesn't formulate this association, then I may react in what I call a single sensory way. And so then my emotional reaction is to that single sensory input. Or a child might, so what we have to do then in our interactions is pace ourselves, slow down, and bring about that connectivity. Just like a young infant who is, say, 9 months old and they hear a plane and they've got that look on their face, and the caregiver picks the child up and goes, oh, look, it's a plane. And so now you're connecting emotion with the visual image, and they go, oh, I hear the plane. And then the child points out. Now, some children hear the plane before we hear it because they're frequency of the train. So the plane is like, I'm hearing it. So there's all of these differences that we have to understand. And I think about touch. Some people say this child is avoidant of touch, or I can't get them to wear their socks. I can't get that thing. And I always say to adults, how many times have you gone and bought an outfit and you really liked it, and then you bring it home and you won't wear it because it doesn't feel good? And as adults, we select that. And with a lot of children, they come in and they won't wear jeans. And I will say, what works for you? As opposed to, you've got to do this. We want to think about what's working for you, and you're telling us what it is. So we have to really appreciate that strengths and admire it, rather than trying to fit. If you've got the circle and you have a square peg and you can't fit the square peg you have to tailor whatever the woodwork so that you can fit the square peg in. And I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was going to ask, in terms of, again, from your experience, do you think we're making progress in that area in terms of kind of accepting that, like, again, some of these differences, and like I said, just accepting, like, okay, they don't like to wear jeans. It makes it feel weird. And I think that, and again, that we were guilty of that at times, right? Like, you're like, well, there was just such a pressure, and again, probably more internal than anything else. Like, oh, we want them to fit in, right? Now it's less about that than like, let them be who they are. I hope you're enjoying the lighter side of the spectrum. So far, we're commercial free, but if you're finding value here, one way to support the show is by considering me for a speaking engagement. I speak on unlocking potential, whether it's for individuals like my son or for entire organizations. I also offer fractional CMO services for businesses needing strategic marketing support without the full-time commitment. drawing on over 35 years of experience in marketing. My agency has helped companies and healthcare practices increase their value, grow, and even prepare for acquisition. To learn more about my speaking topics, visit davidkoffer.com. Or if you're interested in our marketing or fractional CMO services, check out koffermarketing.com. If you're enjoying this episode, please leave a review. Your feedback means a lot, and it helps me make this podcast even more useful. Lastly, don't forget to share it with anyone who would appreciate the insights and stories we're sharing here. Thanks again for listening.
The big thing is now, I would say, the neurodiversity movement has been so powerful in terms of opening up the eyes of the community and the voice of autistic adults talking about their experiences has been amazing. I don't know if you know of Kieran Rose from Autism Advocacy from the UK. He's very eloquent in terms of talking about what his experiences are and really helping everybody understand, we're all normal and we all have our strengths and we all have our differences. And I think that's a really important factor when we think about things too. And going back to, say, the clothing, say you want the child to wear jeans, and then when they wear jeans, that sensation is like a Mack truck coming at me.
Right.
Bombards me so that then I can't shift my attention to other things. So we've got to really think about that it's like, how do we understand the individual and acknowledge what they're really communicating to us?
Yeah, one of the things we learned early on, even though, again, Stone, for all intents and purposes, is kind of non-speaking. I would say minimal to unreliable speaking. He has some language. Well, and occasionally has used them as be able to pair them up appropriately. And the one thing that he was able to communicate from a young age was cut it. We understood cut it, and that always happened whenever we would get him a new shirt or anything that he would have to wear. He would bring it to us. He'd be holding the label up and say, "Cut it, please, cut it." Wow. And so that was just like, that's just become one of the things we do. And you know what? It's like, he's right. Because now it's funny. Now when I'm more conscientious of it. So now if I get clothing or something with a tag, I'm like, that is kind of annoying. I don't want that tag there. And like you said, you all of a sudden, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that kind of example that you gave. If there's something that's bothering you, it's the proverbial rock in the shoe, right? Or pebble. All you're doing is you're thinking about that one thing that's just bugging the heck out of you. And you're not able to cope with other things. You're not going to be problem solving or do anything. You're thinking about that thing that's bugging you right there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's really important to really, and again, so then we're thinking about the environment and how do we alter the environment to be able to help that organization, that feeling of being organized, being calm and available for social interaction, which is there. How do we create that environment to be able to support every individual to access that social interaction and social communication?
Another area that you've had experience with that, again, worked out really well for us, you were a great resource for us as we were going through some challenges with the school district, but you mentioned that you had experience with spelling and knowing, not working with non-speakers, not directly on the spelling per se, but having former clients of yours really early, right? I mean, because again, we feel like it's early now, but it goes back a number of years. I remember you telling me a story about one individual who you've been close to for a number of years. I was wondering if you could share that.
This is a young man who's now 30, and I've known him since he was 3 or 4. And again, he was a non-speaking autistic individual. And as he became able to type, a couple of things he came out with, which I think is very important for us. He said, he typed and he said, if I walk away, it doesn't mean I am leaving and disinterested in what's going on. I can't organize my body. My body I have the plan in my mind, but I can't make my body do it in that moment. And then one day I was with him, and this is probably 2 years ago. And I said to him, everybody talks about non-speaking, non-verbal, minimally speaking, autistic individuals. What do you feel is the most appropriate? What's the most respectful thing that we can say? Yeah. We can say, and he said motor challenged. And I
like that.
That's an important factor and it's different from somebody, say, who had a stroke. It's like, I think what we're discovering is so many individuals who are motor challenged and
I
so
like that a lot.
cannot produce the oral organization to produce the words, they still have they're still taking in everything and they're formulating intellectual ideas and intellectual understanding. But everybody takes sometimes an individual who is motor challenged in terms of expression as cognitively impaired. And what we're discovering is that that's not the case. That
Not at all.
so many of the young adults and children are being able to express now what is really within them. The other part about it was the factor that throughout, particularly in Australia and other parts of the country, say the UK, autistic individuals are saying we have to be the ones who are an integral part of developing the research, not the middle-class white individuals in the towers of university, but we need to have our voice in terms of how you are exploring and understanding who we are.
That's good.
That's an
good.
important factor too.
Yeah. All right. So this is a good time. We talked about, I know, again, based on your experience, that you have some tips and tricks that you can offer to our audience. So, producer Dave, let's go ahead and bring in our little intro music for the tip of the day.
Hey, parents, gather around, it's time to speak. We're here with your tip of the week. Strategies and wisdom just for you. Autism parents, we know what you go through.
All right. That it's time for our tip of the day. Rosemary, what do you got for us?
Oh my, check in on yourself. Think about waiting. I often say one of the most important things is to say to yourself, WAIT. So that's an important factor, because if we think about autism as having an underlying motor challenges, motor differences, it takes a long time to get myself organized to be able to take what I'm thinking up here and expressing it. And even children who are expressing things, we still need to wait. The other thing I would say is think about rhythm and timing. Rhythm and timing, and just rhythmicity is really an important thing in terms of...
What do you mean by that? Yeah, can you go into that a little bit more?
The rhythm of your voice, the rhythm of your action. We're in a very fast-paced world. And sometimes if we slow down or bring in some rhythm to really create this back and forth flow. We call that co-regulation. Co-regulation is my ability to order my actions and my interactions in relation to who I'm engaging with, to be able to keep the interaction going. So rhythm and timing is the rhythmicity of our interactions is really important, and giving that space to allow every individual to be there, I think, is important. So that's...
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know, again, those are things that are practiced kind of in floor time as well. Again, I remember that's something I learned, like I said, kind of that getting into that rhythm with your child. And yeah, and again, it's one of those things when you step back, you think about it, it only makes sense, because like you were saying, with any other conversation, we kind of naturally adapt to the conversation and the flow and going back and forth. Oh, we have our visitors.
Yeah.
Stone has entered the house. Okay. Hang out. All right. He likes to check in.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. What are some of the changes that you've seen in terms of advocacy, and kind of that's one of the things we're seeing more of? Obviously, that's something I'm interested in and kind of the point of the show, but just kind of across the board when it comes to advocacy and ways that can effectively support and understand kids on the spectrum, I know, or with sensory needs, we'll say, communication sensory needs.
Well, I think one of the things that is important, like as you said, I've done a lot of work all over the world. And I was in Peru a couple of years ago, and we were out in terms of these very poor villages and things like this. And so often the children who had autism were hidden away. And I think one of the things that's really important is get out there into the community, find where it's comfortable for your child to be, your adolescent, your adult to be, and be there, be present rather than avoiding places, but also going to places that are comfortable for the individual too. Because when your child or adult is comfortable, you're comfortable too.
And yeah, that's very, very true. And I think, again, I've kind of talked about this in earlier pods. I think even in the first one with our producer, David, like I said, fellow autism dad. I'm talking about, again, like you said, environment is so important, and how fortunate I feel, again, to kind of live in the community that we live in the sense that it's been very accepting. We haven't had too many of those, like, any really kind of incidents. Fortunately, dirty looks. I mean, you get surprised looks, right, with some of the things. But that helps so much, right? I mean, because gosh, it's so much work anyway, being a parent, any kind of parent. And then you're kind of you're on heightened alert when you're dealing with other issues that sometimes come along with our kind of kids, whether it may be eloping or just, again, the sensitivity and just hyperactivity. There's a lot that goes into it. Like you said, having that environment where it feels welcoming and accepted, I think, is so critical.
I keep looking at your background, and I can see being down on the waterfront in Edmonds is such for so many people, whether they are autistic or not, it's a very calming environment. And then I have a number of children and also young adults who love the trains, and going down to all the areas in Seattle where you can go and watch the trains, and the comfort of parents embracing that and going down with their child, I think is really, I think that one young man who's 19, who I, again, seen since he was 3 years old, and he loves the trains, and Dad takes him to the trains because it sort of sets up that calmness rather than like, oh, we're going to go and see the trains again.
Right. Well, you'll love this because, again, that's funny. Again, just being lucky in terms of where we live. Like you're absolutely right. I mean, I cannot tell you how many hours we have spent at the waterfront. We live close by, and it's totally been Stone's happy place since he was young. But the bonus is he also loves trains, and gets back to he's a big fan of the children's show Little Einsteins that was popular when he was young, and there's episodes where it features a train. And anyway, he loved the crossing gates, right? The ding 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 and all that went into that. Well, the train goes right by the waterfront here in Edmonds. So when he was younger, it was like a double bonus. I'd be able to take him to the waterfront, and we were able to get the water and the train all at the same time.
The other thing about the trains is they're predictable. There's a predictability about trains, which I think if the world doesn't feel predictable for me, and I've got a train track, even with Thomas, and I put the train track together, then there's a predictability in it too. And that can be very soothing. And then when you watch the industrial trains going down through Edmonds, BMI, I think is, or whatever it is, they have 80 carriages.
Oh yeah, they're super long.
And so, but there's a predictability that it's going to go on and on and on. And I know there's a beginning, middle, and end.
Interesting. I never thought about that.
So there's a lot of things when we look at what individuals crave towards, like even timetables of the trains. There's a predictability that, and even our sound, my new light rail is very predictable. Every 8 minutes, it's going to come to the Mortlake Terrace station. So predictability about that, which can be, unless the train gets a problem, which can happen, but there's a predictability which can be very soothing for an individual.
Yeah, and predictability, schedules, right, routines are really important for a lot of this population.
But even for people who are not autistic.
True. Well, yeah, that's very true. And especially, in this day and age, right? It just where there seems like there's just a lot of chaos recently. And again, I think we're all kind of looking for that predictability.
Yeah.
One of the questions I want to ask you again is, again, you focused within this area of therapy, but I'm sure you get the questions like looking at, again, maybe the parent with the younger kids who were recently diagnosed or whatever. And as I told you, it could be so overwhelming for a new parent. How do you coach them in terms of what steps would you recommend they take in terms of what therapies to explore and how to kind of pace themselves, like you said, because it can be so overwhelming. What kind of advice would you give someone in those shoes?
Well, I suppose one of the things, obviously, I'm very much a big proponent of relationship-based approach.
Yeah.
And that the parent feels that they're guiding what they want for their child, but they're parenting for their child, and that the provider is not dogmatic about you have to do this and you have to do that, but rather really in the relationship with the parent, helping the parent have their voice and what's really important for them and their child. So I think that's a really important thing, because we can alter what we're doing to meet the desires of the caregiver and the child. I think that's an important factor. Someone who has and I suppose what I want to say too is somebody who has an agenda on the product and not the process. So I really look at the process. So it's not as though you have to play with this toy and it has to be in this way that was described on the box. What we want to do is discover how the child is experiencing it, and also joining the parent in believing what they're telling us. Like, a lot of children come to us in our practice because the child has what we call regulation challenges. They tend to get very easily escalated, and they might have a lot of very intense frenetic activity, which can be very derailing for the family. And for me, I have to really think about what are the triggers for this? What is it that we're doing? It can be that the room is too busy, and that can be a trigger. Or I want attention. I want to engage with mommy, but mommy's talking to my brother.
Right.
That happens in everyday life I have 4 children, and so it happened all the time when they were little.
Right. Yeah, that's normal, right?
Yeah. But if I have this really need for connection with mom or dad because it helps me feel anchored, then that shifting of attention to another child could make them feel more vulnerable. And how do we balance that without taking away from the other child? So there's so many things, like I think about that. I think a lot about the parent. I think the provider getting to know the parent is really important, and not coming in like I find it really hard to establish this goal, that goal, that's sort of in a box rather than going with the flow. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I do. I really like the emphasis on, like you said, the relationship building, and because again, it flows in naturally with, I think, some of the challenges the parent, like I said, parenting with particularly with multiple children have anyway. I was just gonna say a quick story as far as that goes is just learning since Stone has been able to start communicating. Again, he's been able to share stories, and one of the stories he wrote and shared is talking about how he would try to get our attention. Like he would hear us talking with Ty and having these conversations, and we'd be talking about whatever, and it really bothered him. Like he wanted to be part of it, so he would come in and intentionally interrupt us. Like he would just kind of create a scene, and of course we didn't realize that at the time, right? We're just like, hey, Stone, just he be quiet, instead of really trying to say, okay, he needs something, he needs attention from us right now. We didn't necessarily have that awareness that we do now.
Yeah. And I think that if you're in another family where the child maybe doesn't have autism, but there are 2 or 3 other children, the way of them getting that vibe for being able to be a part of the attention might be doing something that's really tricky or something that pulls your attention away. So instead of looking at it as, I suppose I want to say too, I suppose my mind always thinks about when a parent comes in with this is something I'm concerned about. I always come back and say, let's look about what happens in the typical developmental trajectory, because so often it's not fitting into the autism components or autism box, but rather it's a reflection of the developmental trajectory of all children.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we're almost out of time, but one of the things I want to close with is what's on the horizon. What gives you hope, Rosemary? What gives you hope right now? I think a lot of us can use some hopeful thoughts, both whether it's in general or again within this world that we live in on the spectrum, so to speak.
I think I suppose what I really want people to think about is we're all neurodiverse. Instead of putting people into diagnostic categories, let's look about where our strengths are and where we need a little bit of support. And that, I think, can be as we're supporting the development of a child, but we're also thinking about the world, because the world is really in a different state now. And so really being able to think about what are the strengths that are coming in, where do we need more support, whether it be in our immediate, our immediate state or country or the world. I have a lot of colleagues in different parts of the world, and we're all communicating at the moment to support one another.
It's so critical. Yeah, I agree. We need community. We need that support, like you said, in different ways at different levels. Probably, like you said, more now than ever. So thank you. So what I'm gonna do is post your contact information, if that's okay, in our show notes for people if they have questions who want to reach out to Rosemary directly, as well as I'll include the website to your business. But I know you guys are busy enough.
Thank you. But also the Perfectum website, which is where I'm on senior faculty, that will give you a lot of information about DIR Floor Time.
Oh, absolutely. We'll also include that, so everyone take a look at that. And so I just want to say thank you. Was there anything else you want to add? It looked like you're going to say something.
Yeah, I was just about to say something too. There's also on Perfectum, the Perfectum Parent Toolbox.
Oh,
which
great.
is a free program for parents and other professionals. And we put it together in 2016, and it's with Serena Weeder, clinical psychologist, Ricky Robinson, a pediatrician, myself, Sherry Khan, who's a speech and language pathologist, and Monica Osgood. And
wow.
Who's an educator. And it's got over 25 webcasts, over 100 video clips. And they're about 30 minutes long. And it's like, this is what we're going to be focusing on. Now, the good news is that once we videotaped it and we put it all together in terms of our recordings, we then sent it to California to a group that is the name that's going to come to me after a while. It'll synapse in a little bit, but it's a group of individuals who are autistic, who are neurodiverse, who are passionate about graphics, and they do all of this incredible work. So they took our raw information and turned it into a really brilliant production.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and they do work like with Hollywood. When you've got a movie that's set in the 1920s and someone leaves a Starbucks cup in there, they take it in and wipe out all of those. They look at the intricate detail.
Oh yeah, perfect.
and do a lot of work with Hollywood. So they are the group who did our editing and production.
I want to check that out.
Yeah, it'll come to me. Anyway, I can email you what the name of it is.
Okay, yeah. We'll include that. Like I said, we'll provide that for others. What a great resource. Like I said, gosh, where was that 15 years ago?
He was still putting it together.
Still putting it together. Yeah, no, I know. Obviously it's a different world, but thank you again, Rosemary, for joining me and sharing your thoughts and insight and expertise. Thank you to all those of you out there watching and listening. As I mentioned before, provide us with your feedback. Please share this with those in your world who may be touched by autism in a different way. For now, this is David Coffer saying goodbye, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for having me.